Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone, to the House Committee on General and Housing. And today is Friday, May 2nd. We are in the midst of discussing and walking through S 127, which is the Senate analog to our housing bill, and which will probably be the vehicle by which we move forward with housing bill. So, John, let me explain sort of to you where we are. And one of the things that we really have to decide this morning is how we're going to move forward. And I think what I'm gathering is there may be some scheduling issues, which we will have to deal with and probably loop in leadership. Just, we have sent you a memo which the committee has reviewed and which summarizes all the changes to S 127, which we feel need to be made pursuant to everything the committee has discussed so far. We have not taken a straw poll on the whole thing. That's not what this is. This is, however, consensus of drafting instructions. The first section of this memo is merely everything not related to chips. And it is something that we can speak directly to Cameron about, but yeah, I think it's a practical matter, and you will probably have to confirm for us how you want to work with them. Will be to finalize that 127. That will be a joint effort in your office.
Yeah, I think he's just gonna take whatever I give him and work out how the numbering and all that business works.
Then the next sections are all the changes that we would like to make to draft 5.2, which came out of came out of House Conference. And some of them, what we've done is we've used language where we think that it would be helpful, but there are actually some error. It's clear to us that it would take your drafting. There are some questions where we just don't know the answers, where we're looking to you to help us out and maybe present to us some options or some quick reactions. And I think it's probably worth going over those now. What our intention was, which I'm really wondering about, this bill has to go to Ways and Means. Ways and Means says they're ready for it on Tuesday. So our intention was to hang around here today until we had a draft that we could vote on. And I'm wondering, and that was what we worked out with leadership and with Ways and Means, because after Ways and Means it goes approach. It doesn't have money in it, but it did have money in it. That's enough, apparently. So approach may just be a light touch, but it is going to go to approach. So we can go through this memo if it would help you, or we could just simply say to you, if it would help you have more time, take it and come back to us with a draft. But yes.
I think what might be most helpful, just to make sure we have those 3 questions answered and then go from there.
Yeah, there are some questions that aren't, so maybe we need to talk to you about them. The rest of it is just instructions as to what we've decided.
Yep.
So shall we go through the questions?
Let's do it. And just because I haven't said it yet, John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. But that sounds good.
And John, we haven't scheduled, we'll go over this with Cameron probably early this afternoon after lunch. And we don't have anything else scheduled, but if you feel that you can produce a text for us to review, we will stay here until we can, because we would like to vote one way or the other on this bill this afternoon. And so shall we summarize, shall we quickly go through it?
Yeah, I think if we can quickly go through questions.
Yeah.
And I put little check marks as I've been sitting here, on things that I can just drop in.
Okay,
But
great.
yeah,
All right. So,
would you like for me to just,
I think we have the questions.
shall we just tell you what they
Yeah,
are?
I think that would probably be.
Okay.
quickest.
If you would look at page, 2
Of the memo.
of the memo. The second. Well, on page 2, the bullet says, please address the question of the committee, whether domicile
yes.
or domicile and it says residence right now. I'll tell you what, let's go to the underline.
This is the primary residence requirement.
Yes.
Um,
Do we want domicile or residence? And I don't know the difference. Do you, and it would be helpful. What do you think?
yeah, so we're not using a technical term here when we say primary residence. We don't have a defined term for that purpose. The natural thing that I think of when I think of primary residence is domicile. So I think of because it's asking, did you spend the majority of your year here? But I would just say I don't have anything more to say than it is not a technical term. I think people understand what is meant by primary residence, but if you wanted to leverage the Title 32, which is I think where the definition of domicile is, you could do that.
What does Title 32 say?
Let me see if I can.
I mean, it'd be great if we could just resolve it.
Domicile is the principal dwelling of a person domiciled in the state of Vermont. Doesn't really help you there either. In Homestead, we use the phrase principal dwelling. So clearly we're using terms like principal dwelling, primary residence to get at this concept. I think that you are okay with what you have, but I understand if you want more. I don't know.
Well, even if we were to say, it sounds like if we were to say principal residence or domicile, this doesn't really change too much.
It doesn't. The thing that I dislike about that is you suggest that there's somehow distinct concepts, right? It makes it seem like primary residence is not a domicile, which I think is a more dangerous outcome than.
What is the sense of the committee on this? Shall we leave it as is or shall we change it? Debbie?
Well, it's just that domicile, like you could be called away from your home, your domicile, you could be called away. And you could be away
Months.
months or even a year, but you always intend to come back
Exactly.
to that location. And I felt like, and I could be wrong, but I felt like primary resident was putting a factor in there, like you have to be here for 6 months, or like there was a time associated with it where domicile doesn't have that requirement.
So the intent was definitely for the first piece you were speaking to, that if you are away on vacation and stuff, if you're away for several months, if it's the place that you're returning, that's your primary residence, right? If part of why it is not a technical defined term is it's not asking someone to check. Did you meet this day count, right? If that was the intent, they would have included language to check a day count. You don't have a day count check here. Maybe the best I can offer just under time constraints is that I can think more about domicile when I have time today and think about it. But I would just offer that there's a reason it doesn't have a day count check.
But I'm gonna sort of put a gloss on this and let me see if I'm right. What I think Debbie's concerned about, and which echoes with us, was we want enough flexibility so that someone could, let's say, somebody gets a sabbatical or goes on on the National Guard and they're called up or something like that. And they're gone for 3 months or 4 months and their house is vacant. And let's say they decide that they're gonna rent out their house while they're gone. Is that?
Yeah, I would not think of that as your primary residence. And if you're away for years, that's not your primary residence.
When you're away for a year, how about if you're away for 6 months or 3 months? It's just not defined.
Right. That's the answer. It is not a technically defined term. It is just the concept at this point, and it sounds like the committee wants a firm.
I don't know if the committee wants something firm or not. What do you guys think?
Yeah, you can say.
I prefer domicile because it's easier. If it's questioned, it's easier to verify. Is this where your driver's license is? Is this where the address on your taxes? Is this? It doesn't require a date check, but it does establish that this is home.
I don't think, John, if we want to go with domicile, I don't think you're gonna get any objections.
I'm chilling.
Yeah, I think everybody's okay with that. Okay, another question. Here was an interesting question that was raised. We have a number of honorary attorneys in this city.
Not me.
And, but nonetheless, applying their intelligence to this, they said, you know, what we're doing really here, but if you look at the language of the section,
Yeah.
we're cutting off this whole thing about how long and long term.
Yes.
And the reason is that we heard testimony that it's very hard to follow this for some towns unless they want to, unless they adopt an ordinance, that we're sort of setting a minimum standard. And essentially, it's the kind of first out and the first, renter and or owner. And that raised the question about sham sales. You wanna, Tom, you were the one, you were talking about an analog that exists.
Sure, so. I don't think it's strictly analogous. For purposes of the property transfer tax. If a property is not a second residence, but is a rental. Is a lower transfer tax, and currently the practice is getting rather common to. You only have to say you're going to rent it for 30 days, and then you create an LLC and you rent it to your LLC for 30 days, and that fulfills that, and it saves money on the transfer tax. So there's a loophole there, and what I'm concerned about is if we are only able to say, okay, the first buyer here meets these criteria, but the second buyer, there's no way to verify it, then there's a similar situation where your LLC buys it and then sells it to you, you buy it, and it can be done with, in a week. And then we've short-circuited the purpose of.
We knew that there are ways around this, but we didn't know if there was one that was appropriate for this kind of a use in an ordinance. If there was some simple way to avoid sham sales not avoid them, but discourage them or whatever.
Yeah.
And we just don't know what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the solution to that problem. I think that is real. If you had, and I would just say, if you want to change this line, I wouldn't just cut off the final clause about the durational requirement. I would add an initially in front of the offered to make clear, because if you just cut off the durational, I read that as a perpetual requirement.
Well, that wasn't her intent, so we would add initial.
So I would put initially offered, the first thing I would offer, which is
How about
unhappy.
initial bona fide.
Yeah, you could do something like that. People will always people are paid to find ways around stuff. That is just why lawyers get paid to do it. So,
Okay.
I'm not saying that you can't do, so what I would offer is that you can have other kinds of checks in place, not quite as strong, as maybe what you're thinking, but like this agreement would be provided to Betsy, right? So there's checks, and this is going to be shown publicly as to what.
Oh, it is, yeah.
So there are pressures applied to the agreement itself so that folks can see if they're unhappy with the way that this works. I know that's not a really strong check as to preventing people from just saying, well, okay, you agreed to the terms.
We at least give them the leverage of saying initial bona fide.
Yeah, you could do that. And something that came across in the House, the Commerce version was an information reporting requirement that had the municipality to report of any residents that it knows are not occupied as a primary residence
It's still in here.
through the program.
It's in here.
Exactly. So, so you have a check to, that's like a light-handed way at the other end of seeing, are you experiencing a problem? Because part of the question you have right now is this program isn't rolled out. You don't know if people are going to do this. They might, but you could have this informational reporting check-in and see whether people are in fact doing that. Not the happiest answer, but it is, there are efforts taken in the draft to try to get at that kind of concern, but I think you are correct to identify that, yes, if you only have an initial offer requirement, folks can navigate that and they can sell on the same day that they receive it.
I think that by putting in bona fide, it gives at least leverage. If a town doesn't care, then nothing's gonna happen, but if the town cares, at least it gives the town leverage
And,
to do something.
and will we be able to not monitor, but we'll know if that's a
Yeah.
thing that continues to happen and, you know, like other legislation like that we've had, we've sometimes had to revisit it. And if that seems to be like some sort of scam that's we'll be able to know,
I think
right?
as part of our overall job, I think next session of just making sure that we have VHCD in here to tell us what the result of their attempted finding of gamma and yeah, to see what we can get. So we'll have to see.
But it is that's very important flag.
Okay. The other question is the following. If you look at, if you just scroll down a little further, under project criteria,
Yes.
you'll see for the second bullet. There are a couple of questions under that. You definitively decided to move 60% as the percentage of residential growth square footage to 70.
Mhm.
But it raised some issues for us. And I guess they're almost, I guess they're a little more important in light of the increase to 70, but they're important no matter what. One is, what counts square footage?
Yeah.
And that's one question. Another question was, how do we deal with adaptive reuse? And the thing that comes to mind, the example that came to mind was, what if we have a school that's being reused for housing, but it has in it a gymnasium, which we wish to keep as a gymnasium? Or it has in it a theater, which we wish to keep as a theater. And if that counts, they're huge spaces. And if that counts as part of the square footage, it would almost make it impossible right away to qualify for assistance, I would think. Well,
Yeah.
good. And is there any way to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is part of why there is the subdivision 2 available, which is another route that if you don't meet the minimum threshold and you could have these oddities. In a case like that, I wouldn't expect the board to have a hard time saying, we recognize that, like, this would literally meet the floor area requirements, but for the fact that it was modifying something that had these other structures in place that otherwise wouldn't have been constructed and are to the advantage of the residents at the development, right? So they would have available to them the option under subdivision 2. But to return to the first question about gross floor area, it is a substantive policy choice as to whether you want gross or net or usable floor area. And it would pick up, right, all of the floor space of the development itself. So I think there's a question here related to, attics, basements, that's picked up in that piece, meaning that you would have to get 70% of the floor area being used. There's a question as to how is the basement or attic categorized? Does that count as part of the housing, or is that somehow not dedicated to housing? I think that's ultimately going to be a question for Pepsi to answer. I don't know what they'll say, but given that they have incentives for people are interested in this program working, right? You could imagine that they will construe these in ways that are to the advantage of creating. But it is, we just have the phrase dedicated to housing, which is what the real question is about here, and it will be Pepsi's interpretation that is determining the outcomes for folks that apply. Yeah.
But to clarify, because I hadn't really thought this through, I'm used to rather elaborate municipal ordinances that deal with defining floor area ratio and all that kind of stuff. We're not gonna get into that, but ordinarily, let's say we have a building that is 2 stories, 3 stories, and it's got commercial on the first and it's got residential on the second and third. But let's say it has podium parking. I would think ordinarily, the ordinary approach would be to say, how much of the square footage is residential?
Mhm.
Or how much is allocated to the parking are we gonna allocate
Right.
to the first floor commercial? And how much are we gonna allocate to make that determination? And if it was only residential, the parking, it would be part of the residential.
So I think you are rightly identifying that it is not clear how this would count, and it will be subject to BEPC interpretation. The other complexity I might add here is imagine, for instance, that the infrastructure that you're developing through the tip, through the financing is the parking for that development. You might imagine it conceptually that you should sever the infrastructure you create from the housing that you create. So I don't have a happy answer other than it's going to be subject to BEPC interpretation as to how that works.
Right.
But if you wanted to change it to be more prescriptive, that's something you could say, and parking sheet. You could be more descriptive. There's ways to start building out lots of subject developments, but as you noted, you can create a really complex thing, or you can have a general bucket and you can
I'm curious how the committee feels about this. As a general rule, my experience is once you go down the road of trying to define something like that, you better be willing to go all the way down that road.
Anything not mentioned.
It's just so complicated. There's so many different kinds of development, and if I'm just saying, it is not an easy thing to define if you really want to get.
Yeah. Part of the thinking by why you may have to go all the way down the road, and I think that this is what your comment was getting at, is that as soon as you start to do it, you're kind of backing away from the view that BEPC has a full discretion to determine this category, right? And so you're now taking a stance on something, and it's suggestive that you aren't taking a stance on a particular thing. So that is some of the danger. I'm not saying that you shouldn't consider it. I mean, I would remind you of time constraints, but yes.
It's a
So it's
policy choice.
a policy choice of whether we kind of are gonna go with the idea that this is gonna the stuff that we're gonna leave to BEPC and its rulemaking. Yes,
Can it say something like, be more granular and say net or gross determined by BEPC?
No, it's gonna bring them in on every single one. Right?
Well, so BEPC has to make this determination. I just think if you're making net available, then you've already backed away from the gross floor area requirement, unless your point is, and maybe this is more responsive to your comment, you would want BEPC to make the determination as to which category they think is the best way to think about the project, which is a more administratively burdensome requirement than just applying a percentage rate.
Because every project is going to be different.
right.
Yeah, but if they're just looking to this piece, they just ask 60% of the full floor area, and that's the requirement they have to meet. They also have to make this purpose determination, but if you threw in like net or gross, I think it just creates it creates additional choice for BEPC to make. And I would say if you're just debating the point, then you could just make it net rather than gross, like if you're entering that territory.
I'm inclined to think that leaving the discretionary choice to Pepsi is going to be more efficient, possibly a range rather than a specific number, say 65 to 75% might take a few things off their plate, because I can't envision any building project coming exactly to 70%. So if it's that specific, I would anticipate just about everything is going to go.
Well, BEPC has to approve these projects.
They have to do it anyway.
They have to do it anyway, and they're gonna adopt rules.
So I think we have to, the alternate to having a board with some discretion is having 200 pages of definitions.
I don't know how long.
Really, is that too short?
I'm inclined to just Do that.
Leave it to Pepsi.
Yeah.
with the 70%.
Joe, did you have feelings about this because you were the proponent, which we went along with, of the 70%? What do you think, for example, would it too much weaken your idea if it said, where am I? Okay, if it said primarily residential in the, I'm just saying, in the range of 65 to 75% or something,
If you haven't at least,
or at least.
And then, yeah.
you just.
I think we just leave it at the original and let the board, I mean,
Okay, that's all.
it looks like a pretty involved, intelligent board in the housing world.
Either
I
they are or they aren't.
would hope so.
Yeah. I hope so.
So I'm happy with giving them the discretion of,
Yeah.
because the whole purpose is that they can make decisions on plans that don't meet to the letter
Right.
what we've written down and decide, does this still fit under the broad goal? Right.
One thing we can do, and I'm not saying this to punt everything, I have to agree with Joe, but I think probably one of the things that we ought to be doing next session is inviting Pepsi in after they've had a chance to do some rulemaking
Yeah.
and ask them, what do they think of this? I mean, they may have a little laundry list of suggested changes.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not perfect.
Absolutely.
We're not,
Actually, we are perfect.
Well,
speak for yourself.
Right.
And to be fair, like if they show up with if a town shows up with a project that's 50-50 and they go with it, I'm not gonna say like,
Yeah.
like fine, but if the town wants it, if they're pushing for it,
Mhm.
go for it.
I
You've got
agree.
discretion to make some changes.
I think that those are the open questions as opposed to the instructional.
Okay. I would offer that on the location criteria piece, and I think you guys may have spoken with Ellen, you will need to talk to Ellen as to what these mean. The tier 2 pieces related to planning and subdivisions.
So, Tagali, can we see if we can get Ellen in here?
I will note that she is currently covering for me on the Senate floor, because I can't be there right now.
Yeah, it's that time of year.
Mhm.
Great. Okay, so how would you like to proceed? Do you have any sense as to when we should expect you and your comments back in here? Would you like, if you like, we can take a recess for 10 minutes and you can read this. Or whatever works for you.
Let me look at this low and moderate income housing.
I'll tell you what, would you like a few minutes? Why don't we take a break and you can read it?
Take a break.
Yeah, and then I can just tell you guys if I want to leave and write it.
Are you gonna read it in here or? do you-
Yeah, I'll just sit here and read the.
Okay, we're gonna take 10 minute break. We're gonna come back here a little after